Good afternoon from this concluding day of the World Humanitarian Summit. It's the first ever gathering to bring together the entire humanitarian relief community, as well as a host of other actors to discuss how we can reform the system. In many ways, it's difficult to imagine that it didn't happen sooner. There's an estimated $15 billion gap today between the humanitarian needs on the ground and the funding available to address them. This summit was about figuring out a solution, figuring out ways that we can address that gap and how we can help those most in need. Now, let's talk about who actually showed up at the summit. In some ways, the delegations were a little bit disappointing. The UN was hoping that a lot of high-level delegations, including heads of state, would show up. In the end, only a few donor countries sent their heads of state, led by Germany's Angela Merkel. However, what we did have at the table, which is equally important, was a large number of heads of state from countries that are very deeply affected by the humanitarian crisis throughout the world. So countries including Turkey, Lebanon, and Kenya that are hosting a large number of refugees. Their heads of state were here and they were describing the situation for them and the needs that they felt on the ground. Now, the biggest outcome of the summit is probably what's called the Grand Bargain. This is much discussed and it's been in the works for several years prior to the summit. Everyone we've talked to here says that this is the first step and this is a great agreement in terms of the general principles about how we can fix and how we can reform the humanitarian system. However, everything depends on what happens now after the summit. Now, in addition to the Grand Bargain, there were a few other really big key themes that came up in our coverage of the World Humanitarian Summit. The first one was the private sector. And one of the main messages that they brought to the summit was, please don't treat us like an ATM. We have much more capability and we have much more capacity to help. And in fact, increasingly there's a business case for companies and firms, both locally and internationally, to be involved in the relief system. One of the largest themes at this summit was about cash. How to get cash directly into the hands of beneficiaries. This has come to people's attention because a growing body of evidence indicate that cash raises a whole host of indicators, not just the immediate well-being and the emergency needs of the family, but also long-term stability for the family. So things like healthcare, education, financial inclusion, all of these indicators seem to rise when cash goes directly into the hands of beneficiaries. Now the relief community is looking at how to implement cash distribution as part of the humanitarian system. Another big theme was education in crisis. A new fund called Education Cannot Wait hopes to raise $4 billion over the next 5 years in order to address education needs of children affected by and displaced by conflict. That fund has been in the works for a long time, but it was announced at the summit today, and it's a really incredible showing of cooperation between the business community and politicians. One of the major champions of this fund was former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Everyone at the summit agrees that this is only a first step, and what's really key about making the next steps count is following up on commitments, thinking about new ways to share information, to be innovative, and really take the principles that organize this summit and turn them into action.